Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second event, a part of our series in Science Week called States of Mind. I'm really excited to get the opportunity to chat with Dr. Alfredo Spagna about his research on understanding the connection between attention and visual consciousness. Dr. Spagna is a lecturer here in the Department of Psychology at Columbia, and he's also the director of undergraduate studies in neuroscience and behavior. Dr. Spagna's research focuses on the psychological and neural mechanisms of cognition and consciousness, with a particular interest in visual mechanisms and attentional functions. He is currently devoted to conducting neuroimaging studies to investigate the anatomy, circuitry, and pathology of attentional networks. So, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So to start off, I wanted to ask you how you found your interest in this particular niche of consciousness research and how your research questions have sort of evolved over time.
All right. So it's an interesting and long story. I'm going to give you the short version because it's taken me more than 50 years now of studying this stuff. I did my initial studies on the attentional field, let's say, what people might know from, Michael Posner attentional studies. And I've started my BA and then my master and PhD program by looking at attention, the interaction between different attentional functions, right? Alertness, your ability to pay, to sustain a state of readiness over time, the orienting function, the ability to select part of your visual fields to process stimuli that are in that location, and the executive control function, which is your ability to, perform complex tasks in a sequence manner. But then lately, after over 7 or 8 years of studying attention in isolation, I realized that somehow attention is a function or a cognitive ability that doesn't make sense, or that makes sense only if you look at it by studying the effects of attention on something, which is why the first thing was, of course, consciousness. So what is the relationship between attention and consciousness is one question that seems very simple, but we yet don't know how to answer. Depending on how I phrase the question, I myself will answer this question differently, in the sense that I don't know if I can give you a yes answer to two mutually exclusive options, which are: is attention required to be conscious of things? And I'll tell you yes, whatever is behind me, I'm not paying attention to it, so I'm not really conscious of what's going on in the other room. So attention is necessary for me to be conscious of something. I'm not paying attention to what's in the other room, so I don't know. I'm not conscious of the situation over there. This model will put attention as a prerequisite of consciousness, right? We'll tell you that if you don't have attentional functions anymore, you won't be able to be conscious of things. But at the same time, if I just phrase the sentence or the question differently, I will be, interested or plausible. I'll give you a yes answer also to the other situation, which is consciousness required to pay attention to things? Well, if I'm in a vegetative state, if I'm in a coma, I'm not conscious. So I cannot pay attention to things. You neuroscientist, can come at my bed and tell me, hey, look, here are these 5 fingers, but I'm in a coma, so I cannot pay attention to things because I don't have consciousness. So this completely reverts the pyramid and states that consciousness is required for attention, but we yet don't know how to answer this question. This is how I got there, right? I was like, I need to study attention, or I want to study attention has a mechanism to prioritize information for faster processing, right? And the first question was, okay, so do I need attention to be conscious of this stimuli that I want to be processing more quickly? And I bumped into this fantastic, gigantic literature field, which is exactly the one about the relationship between attention and consciousness. So somehow this answers also the second part of your question, which is, how did my research evolve? It's doing scientific research is something beautiful, especially because one question calls into another question and drives you into another question, and you can just look for fundings on one side and answer those questions on the other side. And it's just very beautiful. So that's a short version that lasted about 10 minutes.
No, that's so amazing that every question seems to lead to 5 more questions that you can try to discover like different answers to. And yeah, that's really cool. And I guess like consciousness has been studied since the beginning of time, it seems like, from Greek philosophers, French philosophers of the 19th century to psychologists such as Sigmund Freud. You know, everyone's been puzzled by consciousness and in its integral role in being a part of our human nature and collective experience. And so Sigmund Freud, he, in his theory of personality, he states how conscious mind consists of everything inside of our awareness. But he also says that things that we're unaware of, like feelings, thoughts, urges, and emotions, he still thought the unconscious mind could influence our behavior. And also for Descartes, who is a prominent philosopher of his time, he had a lot of interesting things to say about consciousness. And he thought that consciousness involved reflection. And so there's a lot of different puzzle pieces that are sort of unfolding as time goes on. And so I want to ask you, based on your research, you specialize in the visual aspects of consciousness, but what would you say is our current understanding of consciousness in the 21st century?
That's a fantastic question. So it is a question that somehow, again, it's funny because it depends who you are asking to. They will give you a different idea of what is that we know about consciousness. We know definitely a few things. We know that if we think about Descartes, and if we think about all these visions that tend to break down something on one side and something on the other side, were substantially incorrect. Were very useful. Were very useful models of how our conscious mind worked, but they really didn't hit the mark. Of course, there's no distinction between mind and brain. It's the brain is, the mind is what the brain does. I mean, at least if you marry a neuroscientific perspective, the brain is the organ and the mind is the result of the functioning of that organ, similarly to what the heart is an organ and the circulation of blood flow is the function, is the result of that functioning, right? Or the stomach and intestine is an organ, and let's say digesting and getting nutrients is the function. So we cannot really break the two because they are so tightly related. Structure is function. So we know by now that that not only we are aware of things, so we are conscious of things that we can put into words, right? Not only we're conscious of our thoughts and in a propositional way, right? In things that we can say, I am Alfredo, and I'm very happy to be here right now. But I'm also conscious of things that I'm not trained to, or life doesn't really require me to put into things or to be able to express. For example, yeah, I don't need to go to the restroom right now. I went to the restroom right before the meeting started. So I know, I'm aware of signals and parts of my body that I'm not really, that life doesn't really require me or task me with putting into words. So this is one important thing. A great field of consciousness studies is now has been developing, but now it's growing more and more into this field of interoception, right? Which are the brain regions and the connection between the autonomic and the central nervous system, and the relationship between all these signals, right? So which part of the brain is sensing and translating bodily sensations into something that makes my daily life richer, right? It's not just bladder, but it's, okay, the temperature in this room is a nice temperature, so I'm having, a nice time. And the light is okay, so I can see you very well, and so on. So this is the first thing that we know, that it's not only consciousness is not something that is about thought processing, right? But it has also non-verbal, not propositional aspects of it, but that we are still conscious of them. And this somehow goes into the second part of your question, which was, what is the unconscious, right? And or let's say, how do we identify something that is unconscious? And well, to be unconscious, something to be unconscious and be studied or be an object of scientific investigation, it means that we have to be able to probe it, right? To scientifically test it. For example, I'm not conscious about the marketing strategies behind placing products in a supermarket, but those still affect whether I'm going to buy this product or that product, right? So the marketing is a lot about unconscious processing, right? So if it's unconscious and I cannot probe it, I cannot test it. So there's no way to say that that it affects my daily life. But this is what Freud, showed from the beginning, saying this is one of the most important, kind of points of Freud, saying we cannot be extremely reductionist, right? We have to be able to. It's not only about blood flow, which is a metaphor also of functional magnetic resonance imaging, right? It's not only. Not everything is physiology, but there is also more. And that more is making our life very, very, very rich and more interesting than if we only experienced life through the physiological signals we're getting. Past experience is one of those examples, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that kind of leads into my next question. So I know that a lot of your research is on visual mental imagery and visual consciousness. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your research for a general audience to get a sense of the questions that you're interested in and some of the findings that you found so far.
Right, for sure. So let's do this. So let's practice a little bit together this idea. So if you think about what is perception, right? So let's use the approach that made cognitive psychology so successful over the years, which is, let's try to subjectively break down the cognitive processes to identify the different pieces that make a specific function. In the case of perception, right? So right now I'm looking at the screen. I'm perceiving visual images, right? And I'm making sense of those images. And somehow I am also not only playing with what I have, but I'm using these images to create a history, right? Okay, the talk has started since about 20 minutes. it's going well. I hear and listen well. I think that the conversation is flowing. So I have a history of those perceptions that are creating some sort of a pool of resources, right? But I also am using this perception to create expectation. So those previous perceptions are creating, okay, unless something happens, I think that this is going to be what we're going to do for the next 40, 50 minutes, right? So I'm using perception, my current perception, to establish a past and to predict the future, right? So this is very interesting, and I think it's very interesting, and it tells us something, which is whichever information we get from the external environment, we use it at least for three things: engage with the environment right now, engage with the environment in the past, or try to keep continuity between the past and the current moment, and predict the future, right? Now, if you think about visual mental imagery, it is not very different, or not necessarily very different, which is the first evidence that started this visual imagery field. So visual mental imagery is the same thing as perception, but the stimulus is not in the real world, or better, it's not in the external world. It's in my internal world, right? So a mental image doesn't have the external world calling it, right? But it has the internal world. For example, I'm going to close my eyes and think about a red apple. I can suddenly start having this subjective experience of visualizing something, right? But I can use that information to deal with the past. For example, the mental image of what I did yesterday, right? What did I leave left? What did I left undone from yesterday in my schedule, and so on? But also to predict the past, the future. For example, I want to park my car. Is my car going to fit in that parking spot? This is a way you use spatial mental imagery, right? So this is the size of my car, this is the size of the spot, and you mentally rotate the object to see if you can park it in that spot. So I use mental images for now, for the past, and for the future as well. But there's a few things that are in common, and there are other things that are in common, which are the need of attention to perceive things, right? If I don't pay attention to the monitor and I pay attention there, I'm not perceiving you anymore. I know you are there. You are somehow in my periphery of the visual field. You are there somehow on the screen, but I'm not really perceiving the image as clearly as it was before. Similarly to mental images, if I'm not paying attention to the red apple, well, there's not going to be any red apple in my conscious experience. So first thing. Second thing is perception and mental imagery require consciousness. At a certain point, I need to be conscious of that object in my mind, right? Like there's a moment in this process when I can clearly tell you that if I close my eyes and think about a red apple, there is a moment in which I can tell you, pressing a button, yes, now I got it, right? Okay, there's an apple there. I can see it in my mind. But there's also a few differences. There are also a few differences, and it's getting harder and harder to reconcile the literature distinguishing perception and mental imagery. So first of all, I think you can all use the, do we have the reactions on Zoom for the participants? Can they use the reactions? Or they can raise their hand, right? So I'm gonna ask them, our audience, right, hand raising is fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do an experiment, just a practice this thing. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand when I tell you to do one thing. Raise your hand if you see me. Right. So now you can lower your hand and you can raise your hand again if you think that the experience of seeing me on the monitor was immediate. If you had a feeling of immediacy, like, yeah, I see the guy, or not. Right. So perception, thank you so much, you can lower your hand, you just got an A+. Perception, when is guided by attention, is immediate. I'm going to ask you to do another exercise, which works very well, especially here across the pond. I'm from Italy, so I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and imagine Mona Lisa. And when you are done, open your eyes and raise your hand. Now lower your hand again. And please tell me, raise your hand if you think that the visual image of Mona Lisa was as immediate as the perceptual image you have in front of you. Did you experience Mona Lisa and my face on the screen with the same level of immediacy or vividness? If you did so, raise your hand. There you go. So besides a few of you, the great majority did not or do not or are very easily observe a difference between the two processes. So perception and imagery are similar, but they're also different. And this is nowhere to be found in cognitive neuroscience textbooks. Perception and mental imagery are treated as two almost identical processes. But look at you. We just tested it. I didn't need a chronometer. We all experience it this way. Now let's do another exercise. Raise your hand, close your eyes, think about Mona Lisa, and raise your hand if you think that she's looking at you or not. Close your eyes. You can press the button whenever you want. All right, so lower your hand. One other difference between mental imagery and perception is the effort that you have to make to maintain that image vivid in your mind's eye, this is how they call it, to scan it, right? Like you really have, you don't have to do anything. I'm in front of you. I'm on the screen. Unless you're looking somewhere else, you can imagine if I have AirPods or these are wireless or Bluetooth or cable headphones. So that there's no effort. You can put attention to it, but there's no effort. Well, in the case of, imagining an aspect of a famous painting, it really takes, kind of a hard. It gives you a hard time. She looking at me? I don't know. By the way, Mona Lisa is not looking at you. Mona Lisa is looking slightly to her left. Fair enough. So again, another difference. Mental imagery feels more resource expensive. It really takes, that you push hard to do a specific job. So this sends me to the last part of the answer to this question, which took like a year or a little bit more than a year, to tell you what do we know about mental imagery and consciousness. Very little, but we know one thing that is very important. Individuals without visual cortex, so individuals that due to a tumor, neurodegenerative disease, ablation or resection for surgical treatments of the visual cortex, which, remember, it's in the back of your brain. It doesn't matter where it is, but it processes the visual stimuli, do not perceive things anymore because the visual cortex is gone, but they can imagine things. So that's a key difference, because Paul Broca told you, speaking of, all the stuff, that if you have a lesion to a brain region that performs a specific function, in case of Paul Broca's language production, right? You are not going to be able to produce language anymore. If that region is necessary for that function, you take off the region, you take off the function. But if you take off the visual cortex, you don't take off imagination, which tells you a very important thing, that all the differences that you just experienced between imagery and perception have a biological base. Perception and imagery superficially look like the same, but they are subjectively, objectively, and physiologically very different, And therefore, we need to study them. That's the end of the answer to the question. Did I get an A+?
For sure. That was amazing. Thank you so much. That's probably the most engaging way I've ever heard someone explain their research. So that was very cool. And yeah, that's very interesting that you bring up like mental imagery and perception and how they actually are very different, even though we can easily conflate those two. And again, this kind of leads into my next question, just thinking about the different kinds of mental imagery. So for example, I can voluntarily recall being on the beach with my friends because it's a positive experience that I have. However, there's other forms of mental imagery that involuntarily come into my head. For example, like a past event or a traumatic event that could have happened. And maybe, hallucinations and dreams can be a different kind of mental imagery. So my question to you is, is there a difference between involuntarily or voluntarily having these conjuring up images and scenes in our heads, and is hallucinations and dreams, like where does that fit in to the idea of mental imagery?
That's a fantastic question. And again, it's really cutting edge on the study of mental imagery and consciousness. It's really where we are right now, what we're looking at right now. So let's start by saying this, which is many years ago, I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, which is another French guy, and he said, you cannot be surprised by mental images. Meaning, unless there is a pathological condition or a wiring of the brain that is particular about a specific reason, you cannot really be surprised by mental images, meaning they don't come with that effect of as if somebody walks through the door, right? But there is one condition in the psychiatric manual, at least, that do have surprising mental images, and it's post-traumatic stress disorder. people coming back from the war, for example, from a war, they do report that some things just gets thrown at them, right? Some images just show up and they cannot stop them. So this is a very important question because it gives us a model of normal and abnormal mental imagery. Why am I saying that? Is there a chance that in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, the visual cortex is involved in mental imagery? So is there a chance that that region of the brain that we are not using to imagine things, usually, is involved when we are having these almost real life images that just come to our mind, which is the same case of hallucinatory events, right? So is there a chance that the pathology, the psychiatric condition has a biological base that is also, that has the substrate also on a different cortical activation? What am I trying to say here? One thing, which is steps back to the previous question, which is, if again we use the cognitive psychology approach to understand, mental processes, I can tell you one thing for sure, that I don't want mental images to look and feel like perception. Because if my mental images look and feel like perception, I'm lost. I don't know anymore if this thing in front of me going on is all in my head. There's no conference, you didn't invite me to anything, and I'm speaking at a turned off monitor, or maybe there's no monitor. So I don't want that to happen. So a difference between mental images and perception in the quality of the subjective experience and possibly in the physiological substrate is not only plausible, but it's needed. Otherwise, I am hallucinating all the time. We don't want that. This brings us back to the point we were discussing, which was, okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder, these people have this very constant, often unwanted, unsurprising, but unwanted experiences of the traumatic event. Maybe there, the system is activating a brain network that is closer to the perceptual one than in regular mental imagery. And this is the case of hallucinatory events, right? It could be that hallucination is closer to perception than to normal mental imagery. And dreams and hypnosis and all these different, and Freud's and hypnosis, I mean, that's all where it all started. All these different consciousness states, we are calling them different for a reason. And maybe some of those reasons are exactly because we're changing how the system works. We're asking the system to do something that is not what it's normally being done, which is not just mental image, using the mental imagery network, but adding extra pieces, right? Adding maybe more visual activation to make the hallucination so real, to make our dreams so vivid, and so on. So two take-home messages. The first one, we don't want imagery and perception to be equivalent. When they are, we may be experiencing physiologically and psychologically a distorted reality. So it's telling us a lot about it.
Yeah, that is really, really fascinating. I've never even thought of it in that way or considered the differences of mental imagery and like perception and PTSD. And that's, yeah, that's very, very interesting, especially considering how you were saying like the reason why the reason why people who have PTSD or have more vivid dreams, like it could be just because they have more visual activation, not that there's actual anatomical differences or any other differences. But yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much. And
Right.
yeah, we have a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to hand it off to Ida, and we're going to do a Q&A session.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Hi, Professor Spagna. Thank you so much for
Ida.
your great discussion. It was like really, really fascinating. I agree with Sonali that it was like I never really thought about those differences like that. And yeah, so
Okay.
I have my own questions, but I think I'll start off with some of the things that people have already listed. So one person has asked, can you explain how our brains fill in information for us? Like how our perception of the visual world is sometimes different from reality and how that might relate to attention or what you choose to focus on. Yeah.
Right, that's a great question. And there is this big model that is gaining traction in the neuroscientific literature, which is called a predictive coding model, which is somehow a model of that people are pushing so hard that they say it's the general principle of what the brain does. Meaning, evolutionarily speaking, we grew up in an environment that it was very hostile, and it was so hostile that we really tried to do all possible to make it more familiar, to the point of, having heating system and AC, or heating on and window open. Like, we really changed that environment, and it was so pressuring that we flipped it entirely, because it was very expensive for us to keep trying to use bottom-up information, meaning what you see right now, and top-down information, what you were expecting, to act more quickly on the environment. This is what the predictive model is saying. Your brain is not doing any of this language function, memory. These are all categories that don't exist in reality. Or not that they don't exist, that these are functions that we named from the psychology field before knowing how the brain worked. And now that we know how the brain works, we can say that really memory sees that every region of the brain, every neuron is about memory. Every neuron is getting some visual information. Every neuron is getting some auditory feedback and so on. So let's get rid of that. And they're saying what neurons are doing are somehow constantly mediating the sensory information with the top-down expectation and shaking it together to see if my expectation is met. For example, the computer did not shut down, the light is the same, so my expectations are met, my bottom-up input and my top-down expectation are going well together. So my brain activity is not very heightened, it's regular. But if Ida suddenly starts screaming, I would be like, wait, my bottom-up input, which is somebody yelling, is not meeting my expectation, which was like, just okay, what's going on right now? And therefore my brain will start spinning and use a lot of resources to try to see, what do I do here? Like, how do I handle this new situation? So this is what they call, or one way to explain this constant feeling of we're changing reality, we're filling in reality, right? We are filling in with information that we don't have available, but that is not available to us constantly, but that it's still needed for us to act promptly on the environment. I'm gonna ask you one question. I'll ask you all one question, which is, and I hope I've answered the question, but we can talk more about this, which is very important in the specific historical moment we were living in, which is secluded at home in front of a monitor, which is this. the question for you, and I don't know how to answer this. You have a Q&A, but can they use the chat? Can students use the chat?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Fantastic. Not students, audience. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat to really realize how much predictive coding is an interesting, doesn't have to be true, but an interesting metaphor of what you're doing. And type in the chat, how tall do you think I am? Look at the chat. Try to answer without looking at other people's answers just because of the social conditioning. But if you do, it's okay, don't worry. So the question, I'll repeat it, is type in the chat, how tall do you think I am? Gonna give you a few extra seconds just to enjoy these very tall estimates you're giving. How tall do you think I am? I'm gonna need the extract of the chat later on. All right. And I'm gonna print it and hold it close to my heart because I'm 5'6". Sorry, I'm using the wrong button. And I mean, there was a Q, I'm Italian. I mean, there's no 6'2" in Italy. I forget about it. Like a 6'2", I've never seen one. We don't have that. we just import them from abroad. I'm kidding, but I'm saying like it's very uncommon. 5'6", I'm the tallest in my family. So you can imagine my family picture. Anyway, but you see what you did, and you didn't notice. You were not aware of this, speaking of consciousness. You filled in information with, I guess, a prototypical idea of how tall a person is. Or maybe, maybe it's the camera, because I'm so close that I'm taking so much of the screen, I look like a big guy. But if I go up here, you say, okay, very thin guy. So this perspective is fooling you or is tricking you into believing something, but you do fill in information, and we constantly fill in information. And this is particularly true in Zoom world, because you are used to see me in person in class. If you were one of my students, or if we were at Schermerhorn Hall, you would see me. So you didn't have to do this effort of filling in information with random, kind of numbers. But now you had to do this effort. You change reality, and you've been attending this guy talking for at least 45 minutes, thinking he's 6'2". No, I wish, but this is the predictive coding thing. This is where we fill in reality constantly with information, especially of things that we cannot really, we don't have direct access to. And this is particularly true in Zoom. So particularly true in Zoom Live. So one last thing that I'm gonna say is, if you think that the experience of Zoom class is, I like it, but I don't really like it. I don't know, it feels weird. It's also because you don't have those cues. It's because our social experience is completely disrupted. Our sensory experience is completely disrupted. And our brain is doing a lot of work, which is why you are tired, to constantly fill in information that it's nowhere to be found. So guess what? Yes, let's get back to it. I'm 6'2". Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Spagna. I also really enjoyed you kind of giving that perspective on like the Zoom fatigue and like kind of like more of a psychological perspective to like where that is coming. That's actually really, really interesting. Yeah.
And you call it fatigue. When are you fatigued? When you're doing extra work, right? And what's the extra work we're doing? Well, your brain is filling in stuff that it's used to know about. Like you are using the same mechanism in a Zoom class as in a real person class, but that mechanism requires to fill in with default numbers, like the guy is 6 feet tall, or it's whatever, or he has 2 legs. You didn't see if I have legs. You have to fill in that info, and that's the fatigue, the constantly adding numbers and stuff that you usually will have right in front of you. Maybe.
I think this like relates actually really well to like the next question as well, is like if our brains are designed. I think this also goes back to when you were talking about the top down and bottom up processing of how we finally create that mental image, but it's like an evolutionary kind of creation in a sort of way. And so that leads into like the next question where somebody was asking, you mentioned attention and consciousness leading to faster processing of stimulus. From an evolutionary point of view, do you think people that were better at attending were selected for, and this selection for attentiveness led to consciousness?
So that's for sure. That's for sure. Attention saved our lives so many times. And just think about how you grow up, what one of the first things that people tell you after Baba, Dada, Alfredo, repeat with me, Mommy, Daddy, or Mommy, Mommy, or Daddy, Daddy, or whatever. They tell you, hey, watch out, come on, Aida, pay attention. What are you doing? Pay attention. It's one of the, please understand what I'm trying to tell you. The next thing is you gotta pay attention to what you're doing, otherwise you're gonna get hurt. So if that's something that we teach at 3, 4, 5 years old, it is because it was evolutionarily very important. And we train through this, right? We train and train. And biologically speaking, if you look at what is called, I don't want to be too complex, but the white matter tracks, like the bundles of fibers that connect regions of the brain that are attentional regions, the cables making the 2 regions talk, they are huge, very thick cables. There's a lot of wiring. There is and all myelinated, meaning they all have myelin, meaning they're all convey fast, ultra fast communication. And they are big, very thick, just making sure, or just giving you a visual idea of how important this stuff was, how really we wanted to have big regions connected by big cables so that we can make sure that these 2 regions talk to each other very, very, very quickly. So we have all the evidence we need to say attention was critical in our evolution. And that has also some downsides, but okay, like the over focusing and not enjoying.
Definitely true. I guess another question kind of related to like this plasticity, a little bit of the mind, and like is the way that artists or maybe architects view the world different from non-artists in the field? And like they were asking if the visual part of the brain of these artists or individuals is the visual part is different in any way, and does that affect how their brain works? And I think it's always interesting to consider the intersections of neuroscience with like arts, and I thought that may be an interesting question to bring up from some.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, okay, lots to unpack here. The first thing that I will tell you is there is a beautiful article from a group from Finland. The first author is Toru Dottir. I'm gonna type it in the chat just because it's a Finnish name. It's really difficult. So let me put it to the panelists. Toru Dottir et al. 2020. I'm also gonna copy it in the chat. There you go. Yes, there you go. Okay, so this Finnish group just last year showed that an architect, 55 years old, lost the ability to imagine and therefore to do his job after a lesion to the brain. Very importantly, this person is still able to perform the job at the computer, meaning if he uses Photoshop or whichever software, ArchiCAD, I don't know what's the name of the latest software, he can build the building, he can make it, he can put the, but he cannot anymore just stand up and say, okay, because that we have the wall, so we cannot do, and the outlets there, that's not possible anymore. Going back to the first point I told you, the lesion of the brain is not in the visual cortex, but the lesion of the brain that this guy has is in the inferior temporal cortex. So in a part of the brain is called the fusiform gyrus, that is very close to the area for face perception, object perception, places perception, word recognition, and hippocampus memory. Again, giving you an idea of, you know, we are far away from the occipital cortex. That's not a problem. But if you think about Paul Broca and the Broca area for language production, the fusiform gyrus is the Broca area for imagination, or one of those, because if you get a lesion there, you lose the ability to imagine. This is the first part of the question. Is the brain of an architect different? We don't, sorry, is the brain of an architect different? No, not necessarily, but there is a part of the brain that is particularly important for especially for designing things, right? For the architect example. But there is another thing, which is there's people that are congenitally, I'm gonna write it down, congenitally aphantasics. Meaning there is a huge Facebook group, and I invite you to pick it out, if you check it out, if you have Facebook, of people that they say that they are aphantasics, meaning that they have no ability to imagine things. And maybe some of you is a fantastic and you just don't know, but trust me, when we say that we close our eyes and we see an apple, we see the apple. We don't see an apple as vivid as if it was in front of us, but we see and experience some sort of blurred apple. Individuals with a congenital aphantasia, they don't know it, and they think that when we are saying imagine a red apple, we don't see the apple, but we do see the apple. And they realize this to be aphantastics at 30, 40, 50 years old. Just by random example, from the experiences in life, for example, they're never able to park their car. And that's why I'm terrible at parking. Now I know, because I cannot make that transformation. Or certain life events that brought this to their attention, let's say. So the brain of these people is structurally intact. There's no brain difference with a brain of a person that imagines normally. And also functionally, it doesn't seem that, at least in fMRI, we're not able to detect functional difference in the way the brain works. And the way the brain is and the brain works, they're identical. But subjectively, these people are experiencing aphantasia. So you don't need to have a different brain to have a different conscious experience, which brings us back to the point of this discussion, which is we all have different conscious, phenomenological and conscious experience of reality. But that doesn't have to be reflected on, I have more neurons or less neurons than you. Because again, the mind is a sum of many things, including neurons, but not only. That was a very philosophical answer.
And this location where the architects kind of had that in the fusiform gyres, I know that in your own research as well with the mental imagery, that's where that kind of is localized. Essentially, are you interested?
It's exactly the same point, and it's strange to say it out loud, but it's exactly the same point. So the fusiform gyros seems to be the area, and it goes back also to Sonali's question from before. The role of the fusiform gyros seems to be shown as studies investigating mental imagery. They see this area to be activated with mental imagery function studies. Perception studies, fusiform gyros. Faces, parahippocampal place area, visual word form area. The guy gets a lesion to the fusiform gyrus and he cannot imagine. Dreaming activates fusiform gyrus. Hypnosis activates fusiform gyrus. So these are all 5 different evidence or points heading towards the what's going on in this area. Is this one, if not the only, imagery node of the brain, like Broca area is, again, the language production node, which of course requires a network to function. But if you don't have that region, the whole network cannot do the function anymore. And it seems like this could be the case. And we're lucky because we're lucky, they're not, but individuals, patients with drug refractory epilepsy, so they are epileptic patients that the drug treatment doesn't work. They're usually implanted with electrodes in the brain, so they are awake, alive, in a invasive but not painful procedure to record the brain activity from the temporal lobe, trying to treat the epileptic seizures. And therefore, we are able to record from the fusiform gyrus as people are performing imagery tasks. And this is what we're doing in another project right now, trying to see if really is, if we can get a intracranial picture of the fusiform gyrus as people are imagining things.
That's amazing. That's so cool. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And there is always need for help. Please, we always need people to help us out, do things, please. There's a lot of sensitive questions, little money, and a lot of things to do. So please help us out.
Yes, we will make sure. I guess we can advertise that after our event, if anybody wants to help out with these really cool research projects. There's another question, but I know it's a little bit over time. Let me know if
one more is fine.
Okay, so this is straight from the audience as well. I've heard that from some small portion of the population, visual thinking is their primary form of cognition, even when reasoning through abstract concepts, which lacks a physical basis. Could you explain this process, how it differs from mental imagery or hallucination? And it seems like this kind of relates back to the architect example as well, that you mentioned. So maybe to answer that question. Yeah.
Absolutely. So look how visual we are. Yes, but look how visual we are. If you think about this critically, look what kind of world we created around us. It's 95% visual. We are so drawn to this sensory modality that it's taking over almost entirely our conscious experience. Meaning, we spend time on a phone, which is this. It's give me more images, and scrolling up and down. So we don't know why. I don't know why, but human beings have evolved so strongly to be so visual, drawn to visual items or stimuli. So it's not the case that we have a portion of the population that is at the extreme of this, that they really process the greatest amount of information through visual processes. What I guess you're talking about visual thinking as the primary form of cognition, right? Which is accessing information not through a propositional way, Alfredo is sitting on the chair, right? So I kind of know where things stand because I created a sentence, but Alfredo is sitting on a chair and the image comes up, right? Is the first thing. There's people that have this kind of experience as well. So this is to say that in general, humans are drawn to the visual modality very strongly. Not to the olfactory modality, for example, right? We're not very olfactory people. Mice, rodents are way more olfactory than we are. Kind of okay with auditory, but pigeons are way more auditory than we are. So somehow there is something in the way we all work and process information that is drawing us very much to the visual system. This brings some people that there is the other extreme of aphantasia that we call hyperphantasics people, of being able to vividly represent information that they may have seen one. That people that say, I have a very much photographic memory, right? So I see an image for a second and I can tell you everything that was in that image, right? So I can chew a lot of information from just 1 second bite. And the way it differs from mental imagery is that thoughts, processes, and mental images are two different things, right? Mental images are, or visual mental images at least, are depictive. Thoughts are not necessarily depictive, right? They are more propositional in general. And hallucinations have no contact with reality, right? So the main point of hallucination is there's no, that stimulus is nowhere to be found, not even in the mental images that I have. To conclude, I know this sounds like it's a very complex answer, but one thing that is very important is, and maybe this gives you an example, mental images require long-term memory to be activated. If you don't have Mona Lisa stored somewhere, you won't be able to imagine Mona Lisa. But this doesn't mean that you cannot synthesize things, meaning I can imagine a dog telephone. I can. It doesn't exist, but I can imagine it. I just need to have the components of that synthesized image available, and then I can put them together. Hallucinations are nowhere to be found in reality, right? Are events that they're nowhere to be found, and they usually put together things that are random or less, that don't make sense, which is part of why they are so disruptive in daily life, right? For example, in people with psychosis. It was very long.
No worries. That was a great response. Also a good way to close out with, I feel like, good summary of all the different things we discussed today. I really, really appreciate you having this fireside chat with us, and I think it was really
lovely.
I don't know. I learned a lot, and I thought it was really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm dropping my email in the chat here in case somebody wants to, reach out and keep this discussion going. I'm super happy to.
Yeah, and I guess we're closing out this event, but there's one more for Science Week in CSR, I believe tomorrow. So please check it out. And yeah, I'm really glad that people were able to enjoy this conversation as much as me and Sonali got. It was really fun to moderate this conversation. And I don't know, it's good to talk to people in the neuro department and in psych. It's just good to see everybody, and I've
absolutely
heard a lot about you, but I didn't get to haven't had the chance to see.
And here I am, 5'6", and thank you so much, 5'6" tall, and thank you so much for organizing this and for doing all this extra work that nobody's asking you to do, but these events are super important. So they really speak volume about, the commitment to advancing science and connecting between students. So please keep it up.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you, Professor Spagna. Have a wonderful night. Thank you,
You
everybody.
too. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.